Welcome to the Rhino Resilience Podcast. I'm Chris Rhino Swenson. This is where we build calm strength, grounded resilience, and the mindset to carry what life throws at us, especially in rural life. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Rhino Resilience Podcast, where we build strength for rural life. I'm your host, Chris Swenson, licensed therapist, founder of Rhino Resilience, and most importantly, someone who spent a lifetime around people who know how to work hard, carry responsibility, and push through challenges. Today's episode is called The Gauges You're Ignoring. It's why rural people trust warning signs everywhere except themselves. Now, before you hear that title and think this is going to be just another conversation about mental health, stress, or self-care, let me tell you what this episode is really about. This episode is about protecting your ability to keep doing what matters for the long haul. Because if you're anything like the people I know, you've got responsibilities. You have people counting on you. You have work that needs to be done. There's bills to pay, a family to take care of, and you've got goals and commitments, responsibilities that matter deeply to you. And one of the things that I've noticed over more than 20 years as a therapist is that many of the people who eventually end up sitting across from me, they're not weak. In fact, they're some of the most strongest people that I know. They're people who care deeply about doing the right thing and taking care of others. The problem then isn't like a lack of strength. If anything, many of them have an abundance of strength. The challenge is that they've been carrying so much for so long that they begin losing the ability to sustain it for the long haul. And honestly, this isn't just something I've seen in other people. I've seen it in myself too. I grew up in rural culture, played sports, owned my own businesses, and throughout my life, I've learned many of the same lessons that most of us learn, which is to keep going, push through, don't quit, don't let the team down, handle your responsibilities. And to be clear, these lessons have served me well many times in life. I don't regret at all learning how to work hard or never regret learning how to persevere. But what no one ever taught me was the difference between pushing through something and paying attention to something, because those are not the same thing. You see, this is one of the reasons Rhino Resilience exists. Not because rural people need to become tougher. I've never questioned the toughness of rural people. I've lived among them my entire life. What I've questioned is whether we've been given enough tools to protect that toughness over the long haul. Because real strength isn't just about what you can carry today. It's about protecting your ability to keep carrying what matters tomorrow. That's what this episode is about. It's not about becoming softer. It's not about avoiding hard things. It's not about lowering standards. It's about protecting the strength you've worked so hard to build. And one of the ways we do that is by paying attention to the gauges within us, okay? Just like the gauges in a truck or a tractor or a combine, basically any piece of equipment we depend upon. Those gauges aren't there to stop the mission. They're there to help protect it. And today we're going to talk about the gauges. Many of us notice everywhere else, but often miss in ourselves. So before we get into the heart of this episode, it's time for our oopsie tootsie question of the week. And this question comes from a listener who wrote, Chris, I've noticed that there are two pictures in your background of your videos, one on each side of your head. What are they? Well, first of all, I love this question because it tells me some of you are paying attention. The picture over here is a photograph of me when I was in junior high with my grandma and my great-grandma. And the picture over here is of my grandfather sitting at his desk at the state capitol while serving as a state representative. And, those pictures are there intentionally. Not because they're fancy, not because they look good on camera, but because they remind me of some of the people who have helped shaped who I am. And my grandma and great grandma taught me a lot about family and kindness and perseverance, caring about people. And my grandfather taught me a lot about service, leadership and responsibility, and contributing to something bigger than yourself. And while all three of them are no longer here, their influences, I think about them often. I think about the values they passed down, and I think about the example they set. In many ways, those pictures serve as a reminder of where I came from and what matters most. And as I think about today's episode, that's actually part of what we're talking about. Most of us aren't staying strong just to stay strong, just for the sake of being strong, right? I mean, we're trying to stay strong because there are people, values, responsibilities, and purposes that matter to us. And for me, those pictures are a daily reminder of some of those things. So thanks for the question, and keep them coming. So back to the heart of this episode. One of the reasons I wanted to do this episode is because I think many people underestimate just how skilled rural people are at noticing problems before they become bigger problems. Think about it for a moment. I mean, if you're a farmer or a rancher, maybe you're a mechanic or truck driver, business owner, teacher, first responder, parent, or honestly, just somebody who's been around rural life very long, you've probably developed a pretty good eye for warning signs. You think about it, like a rancher notices when an animal isn't acting quite right. A farmer may notice a new sound in a piece of equipment, just like a mechanic might notice a vibration that wasn't there before. Teachers start noticing when a student withdraws, parents when their child, something's off with their child. And business owners, we notice things that start trending in the wrong direction. Most of us understand that little things do matter. And we also understand that small changes can become big problems if they're ignored long enough. In fact, many of us make our living paying attention, right? We notice, we assess, and we respond because we understand something important. It's usually easier to address a problem early than it is after something breaks down. And honestly, that's not fear. That's not fear, man. That's wisdom. It's wisdom that comes from experience. It's wisdom that comes from understanding how life actually works. Most breakdowns don't happen without a warning. Usually there are signs, some signals, some indicators, little clues that something needs attention. And here's something I've noticed about us rural people. We're often incredibly good at paying attention to things we're responsible for. We notice the equipment. We notice the livestock, the crops, our kids. We notice our neighbors and our communities because those things matter to us. And that's an important point. The reason we pay attention isn't because we're looking for problems. The reason we pay attention is because we're trying to protect something that matters, right? Like a rancher doesn't check on cattle because they don't care about their work. They do it because they care deeply about the work. A farmer is going to perform maintenance because they don't want to use the equipment. They do it because they want that equipment to keep operating season after season, just to keep going. The maintenance protects the mission, right? The gauges protect the mission, right? Those warning signs, that's what we're really talking about today. Not becoming preoccupied with every ache or pain or worry or bad day, right? That's not it. But we're talking about protecting our ability to continue doing the things that matter the most. Because real strength isn't just about what you can carry today. It's about protecting your ability to keep carrying what matters tomorrow. Now, here's what I found fascinating over the years. Most rural people are highly skilled observers, right? Like we notice changes. We notice patterns. We notice when something isn't quite right. In fact, many of us have developed that ability because our responsibilities depend upon it. But somewhere along the way, many of us stopped applying those same observational skills to ourselves. And hell, I've certainly been guilty of this myself. There have been seasons in my own life where I could tell you exactly how my business was doing, what projects were coming up, all the responsibilities, things needed attention. I could tell you what was happening with my family. But if someone had asked me, like, how was I really doing? I probably wouldn't have had much of an answer. Maybe you've experienced something similar, right? You notice when your truck starts running differently. You notice when your cattle start behaving differently. You notice when your child seems off. You notice when your spouse seems stressed, right? Yet you haven't stopped to notice that you've been sleeping poorly for weeks. Or maybe that you're more irritable than usual. Or that you're carrying stress that never seems to let up. Or that you've slowly stopped doing things you once enjoyed. Or maybe that you've become exhausted in ways that rest doesn't seem to fix. One of the lines that keeps coming back to me is this: you trust the gauges on your equipment more than the gauges inside yourself. If the temperature gauge on a tractor suddenly spikes, most of us pay attention. If a warning line comes on in a pickup, most of us at least make a mental note of it. And if a strange noise starts coming from a piece of equipment, we become curious. We want to know what it's trying to tell us, because we understand that paying attention today helps us avoid bigger problems tomorrow. We understand that the maintenance helps protect performance. We understand that those small adjustments now often prevent major repairs later. Yet when our own gauges within ourselves start changing, many of us have a tendency to explain them away. I'm just tired. It's just a busy season. I'll be fine. I just need to push through. And to be clear, this isn't about blaming ourselves. It's not about beating ourselves up for missing the signs. Many of us learn to focus on responsibilities before ourselves, or even learn to keep going when things got hard. Many of us learned to put our heads down and do what needed to be done. And those lessons often helped us succeed. In fact, they probably helped many of us accomplish things we never thought possible. The challenge is that sometimes those same strengths can make it harder to recognize when our own gauges are trying to tell us something. And if we ignore those inner gauges long enough, eventually they begin affecting the very things we're trying to protect: our relationships, our health, our focus, our families, our patience, our leadership, and our ability to keep showing up. That's why this matters. Not because you're weak, not because you're broken, but because what you're carrying matters. And if we're going to continue showing up for the people and the responsibilities that matter most, we need to learn how to pay attention to those inner gauges before the breakdown. So why do we miss these gauges in ourselves? So many of us are actually pretty good at noticing warning signs. But that's the question. Like, why do we struggle to notice them in ourselves? When I think about it, maybe a better question is why do we actually notice them but often ignore them? And I don't think it's because we're stubborn. And I definitely don't think it's because we're weak. And I certainly don't think it's because we're incapable. Honestly, I think many of us have learned this pattern from people we respected. I know I did. Growing up, I learned a lot of valuable lessons. I learned how to work hard. I learned how to be dependable. I learned how to keep going when things got difficult. I learned that when there was work to be done, you did it. And I learned that people were counting on you. And then sports reinforced many of those same lessons. You push through, finish what you started, don't quit, don't let your teammates down, right? And to be clear, I don't think those lessons were bad. Many of them served me incredibly well throughout my life, right? I think the ability to persevere is important. The ability to stay committed is important. And the ability to keep moving forward when things get hard is also important. But there's a difference between pushing through something and paying attention to something, because they're not the same thing. You can be tough and still pay attention. You can be resilient and still pay attention. You can become committed and still pay attention. Those things aren't opposites. Yet many of us learn to treat them like they are. And I think that's especially true in rural culture. There are seasons of life when the work simply has to get done, right? I mean, the cattle still need to be fed, the crops need to be harvested. Your shift still needs to be covered, bills need to be paid, right? Those kids need to be taken care of. Life doesn't always pause just because we're tired. So we learn to put our heads down and keep moving. And honestly, sometimes that's exactly what's required. Like I said, sometimes pushing through is the right answer. But the challenge becomes when a temporary strategy becomes a permanent strategy. When just get through today quietly turns into months or years or decades. And before we know it, we become so focused on the responsibilities around us that we stop paying attention to what matters within us. And I've seen this so much throughout my career. I've sat across from farmers and ranchers and teachers, there's been business owners, even first responders and correction officers. And many of them waited far longer than they needed to before doing something about the gauges that had been flashing for months or sometimes years within them. And not because they didn't know that something was wrong, and not because they lacked strength. I mean, in many cases, it was the exact opposite. They were strong enough to keep functioning, strong enough to keep showing up, strong enough to keep carrying the load, at least for a while. And that's one of the greatest ironies of strength. Sometimes the very qualities that help us succeed are the same qualities that make it harder to recognize when maintenance is needed. But if we're not careful, those strengths can convince us that the answer to every problem is simply carrying more. And that's not what we're after here. Because Rhino Resilience has never been about helping people carry more. It's about helping people carry things differently. It's about protecting the strength you've worked so hard to build. It's about helping you stay capable, not just today, but years from now. Because the goal isn't to prove how much punishment you can take. The goal is to keep showing up for what matters. That's your family, maybe your faith, your work. And that's why paying attention to those inner gauges matters most. Not because something's wrong with you, but because what you're carrying is important. And the stronger the mission, the more important that maintenance becomes. So let's talk about some of these inner gauges that many people experience. And before I do, I want to remind you of something. The goal here isn't to become obsessed with every feeling, every emotion, or every bad day. Because we all have hard days. We all have stressful weeks. Life happens. What we're looking for are patterns, changes, signals, things that are consistently trying to get our attention. Because just like a gauge in a vehicle, man, these signs aren't necessarily the problem. They're information about a problem. This is your mind and body reporting to you. And the sooner we pay attention, the easier it is to make adjustments before things start affecting the people and responsibilities that matter most. So let's take a look at the first gauge, the sleeping gauge. One of the first gauges that often moves is sleep, right? Maybe you're having trouble falling asleep. Maybe you're waking up in the middle of the night. Maybe your mind won't shut off. Or maybe you're actually sleeping, but you're never really feeling rested. I mean, I've certainly experienced this where sleep was one of the first things to change. Now, one bad night doesn't mean anything's wrong. But if you've been sleeping poorly for several weeks, that's information. Your body may be trying to tell you that the load you're carrying is beginning to exceed your recovery. And a simple question to ask yourself is, what has changed recently? Not 6 months ago, not 3 years ago, but what has changed in the last few weeks? Sometimes simply identifying the source of the pressure, it helps us begin addressing it. Because the goal isn't just to get better sleep. The goal is protecting your ability to keep showing up with energy, focus, and steadiness for the people who depend on you. Another gauge is the irritability gauge. This is where, it starts speaking to you when you find yourself snapping more quickly, right? Your patience gets shorter. Little things seem bigger than they should. People who normally wouldn't bother you suddenly do. Now, let's be honest. We've all had moments like that. But if it starts to become your new normal, it's worth paying attention. Many times, irritability is one of the earliest signs of overload. Your system is working hard. Your reserves are running low. And one simple thing that you can do is create a pause before reacting. Take a short walk. Step outside. Use some deep breathing. Just give yourself a few minutes before responding. Because the goal here isn't just becoming less irritable. The goal is protecting your relationships and your ability to lead, parent, teach, coach, or serve the people around you over the long haul. Another gauge would be the isolation gauge. And I think this one is a big one, and you notice the gauge speaking to you when you start pulling away. You stop calling people, you stop returning messages, you stop attending things that you normally enjoy. You convince yourself you're just busy, and sometimes you are, but sometimes isolation becomes a warning sign. And I've said this before on the podcast. If nobody knows what you're carrying, that's isolation. And isolation can have a way of making every load feel heavier. One simple response to this gauge is just to reach out to one person, right? One person, not 10, just one, a friend, a family member, mentor, someone you trust. Because the goal here isn't simply to be more social. The goal is protecting your connection to the people who help you stay grounded when life gets difficult. That helps you in the long haul. Another gauge would be the loss of joy gauge. And this gauge can actually sneak up on people because things you once enjoyed just don't seem interesting anymore, right? Maybe you stop hunting or you stop fishing. You stop working on projects, right? You stop spending time on things that used to fill your tank. Life slowly becomes like all responsibility and very little restoration. And over time, that begins to wear on us. So when you notice this, a simple question to ask yourself is, what have I stopped doing that used to bring me life? And maybe that answer isn't huge change. Maybe it's 30 minutes, an evening, a phone call, a hobby, a walk, conversation. I don't know. Because the goal isn't like entertainment here. As I've alluded to before, the goal is all about protecting the parts of yourself that help sustain you for the journey ahead. And another common gauge is constant overwhelm gauge. And this one I've talked about before. You notice this gauge firing off when everything feels urgent, right? Everything feels important. Everything feels heavy. And no matter how much you get done, it never feels like enough. So when that happens, don't ask how do I fix all of this? Instead, ask, what's the next thing? Just the next one thing. Because clarity creates movement, and movement often reduces overwhelm. Because the goal isn't solving your entire life today. The goal is to protect your ability to keep moving forward tomorrow for the long haul. And here's what I want you to notice. None of these gauges are evidence that you're weak, right? None of them mean you're failing, and none of them mean that you're broken. They're information. That's all. That's it. They're your mind and body doing exactly what gauges are supposed to do, reporting to you, communicating to you, trying to help you notice something before the breakdown. Because the purpose of a gauge, it's not to stop the mission. The purpose of the gauge is actually to help protect the mission. And if we're going to keep showing up for what matters, we need to learn how to start listening when those gauges start talking. You know, as I was thinking about this episode and planning it, there was one thought that just kept coming back to me. Nobody questions maintenance. Like nobody looks at a rancher servicing a tractor and thinks the tractor's weak, right? Nobody looks at a truck in the repair shop and thinks less of the truck. And nobody sees someone taking livestock to a vet and assuming somehow the livestock failed. Nobody sees someone taking their child to a doctor and assumes they're failing as a parent. We understand that maintenance is simply part of caring for something valuable. In fact, like the more valuable something is, the more attention we usually give it. The more important the mission is, the more seriously we take the maintenance because we understand something. Maintenance isn't the opposite of performance. Maintenance protects the performance for the long haul, right? I mean, think about it. A rancher doesn't maintain equipment because they don't plan to use it. They maintain it because they absolutely plan to use it for the long haul, as long as they can get out of it. Same thing about that, like a farmer doesn't change the oil because the tractor's weak. They change the oil because they want the tractor running when they need it the most. The maintenance protects the mission. And yet sometimes when it comes to ourselves, we apply a completely different standard. We tell ourselves to just push through, handle it, figure it out, keep going. And again, I want to be careful here because there are times in life when pushing through is exactly what needs to be done. I've done it. You've probably done it too. There are seasons when responsibilities just don't disappear. The work still needs to be done, right? The bills still need to be paid. Life doesn't always give us the luxury of hitting the pause button. But pushing through and paying attention are not opposites. That's one of the biggest lessons I've learned. You can be tough and still pay attention. You can be resilient and still pay attention. You can be committed and still pay attention. You keep moving forward and still listen to those gauges. Those things can exist together because you want to do it for the long haul, not just today. In fact, I would argue, but like that's where wisdom begins. Because eventually we have to ask ourselves a question. Out here, what kind of strength are we really trying to build? Are we trying to build strength for today or strength for the long haul? Because those are not necessarily the same thing. Most people can push through for a day. Many people, they can push through for a week, even months. But eventually biology gets a vote. The body keeps the score. Eventually the gauges begin reporting what the system has been carrying, not because we're weak, because we're human. And because every system has limits. I've seen this throughout my career. Some of the strongest people I've ever met ended up struggling, not because they lacked toughness, but because they believed toughness meant ignoring their gauges. The people everyone depends on. Those are the people. Parents, first responders, teachers, farmers, ranchers. Many of them were incredibly capable. The issue wasn't strength at all. The issue was sustainability. Nobody have ever taught them that protecting strength is part of strength. And honestly, that's a big part of why Rhino Resilience exists. I've never been interested in convincing rural people to be tougher. Rural people already know how to be tough. I've seen it my entire life. What interests me is helping people stay strong, helping people stay capable, stay connected, helping people continue to show up for the people that matter most. Because when I think about resilience, I don't think about surviving one difficult day. I think about being there for your spouse 10 years from now. I think about being there for your kids and your grandkids. I think about continuing to lead your business and serve your community, living your values, pursuing your purpose. That's the kind of strength I'm interested in for the long haul. And that's why maintenance matters. Not because something's wrong with you, not because you're broken or you failed. Maintenance matters because what you're carrying matters. You know, the people in your life, man, they matter, right? And if those things matter, then protecting your ability to continue showing up for them matters too. Real strength isn't just about what you can carry today. It's about protecting your ability to keep carrying what matters tomorrow. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final thought. Those inner gauges within you are not the enemy. The gauges are not proof that you're weak. They're not evidence that you're failing. They're just information. That's all they are. They're your mind and body doing exactly what gauges are supposed to do. They're reporting, they're communicating to you. They're trying to get your attention before breakdown gets your attention. And when you think about it that way, the goal isn't to fear the gauges. The goal isn't to ignore them either. The goal is simply to become curious, to pause long enough to ask, what might this be telling me? Because that's exactly what we do with the things we care about. Like I said, if a warning light comes on in a truck, we become curious. There's a strange sound that starts coming from a piece of equipment, we become curious. Not because we're panicking, but because we're paying attention. And maybe that's the invitation from today's episode. You know, to start paying attention to ourselves with the same care that we give the things we're responsible for. Not because we're more important than everyone else, but because we're often carrying responsibilities that matter deeply. And the goal isn't to carry less. The goal is to remain capable of carrying what matters for the long haul. And that's why paying attention to the gauges matters. Not because you're weak, not because you're broken, but because what you're carrying is important. You know, I've spent more than 20 years sitting across from people who are trying to carry enormous loads. And one thing I learned is that most of them didn't need someone to convince them to be stronger. They already were strong. What they needed was a way to protect that strength. You know, a way to sustain it, a way to keep showing up for that long haul. And that's what Rhino Resilience is all about. Helping rural people understand what they're carrying so they can carry it differently. Because real strength isn't just about what you can carry today. It's about protecting your ability to keep carrying what matters tomorrow. So this week, pay attention to those inner gauges. Not with fear, not with judgment, just with curiosity. And if one of them has been trying to get your attention lately, maybe take one small step towards addressing it. Remember, warning lights are easier to deal with than full breakdowns. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. And if this episode was helpful, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And be sure to subscribe, follow the podcast, and sign up for the newsletter at rhinoresilience.com. You already know how to push through. You know, my job with Rhino Resilience is to help you protect that strength so that you can keep living, leading, serving, and staying connected for the long haul. Until next time, stay steady. We're in this together.